Good morning to all of you. I'm happy to be on the record. As just introduced, I know myself actually very little about the appliances that you're dealing with, because I took this work over from a colleague just a few months ago when most of it was done. But I have been dealing for the last 4 years with our Ecodesign and energy labeling regulations on solid fuel boilers, where a process that we ran in parallel. So while I don't know the details of your appliances, I know quite a bit, at least, about our process in terms of regulation. I'll start really from the start. I'm working in a team of, in total, about 10 people across the European Commission, working on product policy and energy efficiency. Our main two pieces of legislation are Ecodesign and energy labeling. We have a few more specific ones. And often we have Ecodesign and energy labeling for the same appliances, certainly when they're consumer goods. Because they do a different thing. Ecodesign sets certain criteria that have to be met in order to be placed on the EU market. Whereas labeling promotes further efficiency by distinguishing through a label the efficiency for consumers. Labeling is very focused on the energy in the use phase, whereas Ecodesign can in fact address any significant environmental parameter. Usually, of course, that is the first thing that we do address is energy in the use phase, because we're talking about energy using or energy related appliances, so that's the first major impact that there is of those appliances. But certainly in this case, where we're talking today, there are other environmental impacts that we regulated through Ecodesign. In total, we have, I think, about 43 regulations on different product groups. Some of them have already been in place for a long time, where we have a lot of experience. But the most recent ones include the ones on local space heaters and solid fuel boilers. And the list for labeling is a bit shorter, because we usually do, with a few exceptions, we usually do them only for consumer goods. There's a whole process on how we get to these regulations. So these regulations for local space heaters were published last year, July. And there's a whole process in advance of that, which should, on average, take about 4 years, but it can well take a lot longer if there are complexities involved. There's a whole study process first, where we have an external contractor usually looking into a product really in detail for a year and a half or even 2 years. And some of you may have been involved in this process. And then after the consultant has done its work, we as the Commission take over the work, although they might still support us, where we actually then come up with draft legislation and consult on that, do an impact assessment, and conclude a number of stages. Then we actually have different processes towards the end for Ecodesign and energy labeling, because the original parent directives were adopted at different times, which means different rules. Under Ecodesign, so the Ecodesign directive is a framework, and what we here do for every specific regulation is do a specific regulation under that framework, implementing it for a specific appliance. And member states experts actually vote on it, and we have to achieve a certain majority for it to pass. Whereas on energy labeling, member states experts only advise us. It's the Commission that makes the final decision. Once we have those regulations in place, it's for manufacturers to implement them. That means ensuring compliance, particularly through testing, that the products meet the requirements. But that testing can be in-house testing. It can be a third party doing it, but it's allowed to be in-house testing. And an important part, apart from fixing the CE marking, is that there has to be technical documentation. You have to have evidence that you tested and that the product is compliant, and you provide this evidence on request to member states authorities when they ask for it. There's also a role of standards in this process. If there are harmonized standards of which the Commission has published references in the official journal of the EU, which I'll explain a bit later, then there is a so-called, if you use the methods that are in those standards, there's a so-called presumption of conformity. That means enforcement authorities will initially assume that you're conform with the requirements. Of course, they can still check. The second thing that it means, that makes it easier for you to do your technical documentation, because when describing which method you use to measure, you can simply refer to that standard, and you don't have to give all further details of the measurement method. I just mentioned enforcement. Enforcement for this policy is done at the member state level. And in fact, in some member states, they've even devolved it to a regional level. For example, in Germany and Spain, it's the regional authorities that have the competence to enforce the regulations. They do this by asking you for technical documentation and check it, a paper check to see whether everything seems in order. But they also test appliances. And they select these test appliances sometimes on a random basis, but they can also, quite often, they look for those appliances where they may think there's more risk that they're not compliant. This could be a brand that has shown in the past to be non-compliant. It could be from certain intelligence they receive. They can come from different things. And although this is all done on a national level, there is cooperation on a European level. When they find a non-compliance or suspect there is one, they notify each other through a database, but also twice a year all the people who are in charge of enforcement meet and discuss common challenges. Of course, they have a lot of product groups to discuss, about 25 products in total. But that's done twice a year, and of course then they have more frequent contact if necessary as well. Something we as the Commission do in addition is we actually provide some extra funding for member states to cooperate together in this area. They will have to apply through specific projects. There are a number of those. I mentioned one of the names here on the slide. That's the one that's been finished. It's called Ecodesign, where member states worked together, tested appliances together, looked whether there were barriers. For example, when an appliance was tested in Denmark but found to be non-compliant, and it was then the UK Market Surveillance Authority who followed up on that to see whether there were any logistical problems or legal problems. So they've looked into all these issues, how to cooperate well in this area. Now I'll go into detail on the actual appliances that we're talking about today here. We call them local space heaters. That's the name we coined quite long ago, but essentially they're mostly single room heaters. I already mentioned the particular thing compared to many of our other appliances is that is the regulations for emissions, for 4 different types of emissions, in addition to the requirement on energy efficiency. Something else that's particular is that the requirements will only apply from the year 2022 for new appliances. All this legislation only applies to new appliances. Usually we let these requirements apply sooner for this type of legislation, but here, in fact, dealing with so many different types of emissions is a novelty. So we had to reconcile the fact that there were different approaches across Europe in terms of what was considered good in terms of emissions. So the solution there is to give more time for this harmonization on European level. As you can see at the bottom of my slide, there's a small asterisk indicating, as you know, that it's much more complex even than I mentioned here, because when it comes to a particular matter, at present across Europe we have several different measurement methods, and in the context of negotiations on this regulation, it was not possible to agree already on a single one, though everybody agreed that in future this should be the case. But at present, it wasn't possible to agree on a single method that should be used. So therefore, actually, in terms for particular matter, there are 3 different measurement methods allowed, and each of them has the separate requirements. And the manufacturer can choose which to apply, which method with the accompanying requirements. In case you're not familiar with them, I've copy-pasted the part of the regulation that actually details these requirements. Maybe, I'm not sure whether you can read it or not, but that gives you immediately an idea of the level of detail that we do in regulation. So we set requirements, so it has to be 40 milligrams, for example, per cubic meter, maximum of emissions. That's the essential requirement that we set in the regulation. Then, of course, we need to have a bit more guidance or rules on how you actually come to this calculation. So this is the detail that we lay down generally on how this should be measured. But that's as much as we can do in legislation. We don't detail every single step of a measurement method that you do. That we leave, that it's common for product legislation in Europe to leave that to standardization processes. So standardization in this context, ideally standardization standards, measurement methods are developed in parallel with the regulation. And luckily also in this case there's already in the past there has been a lot of standardization work already. But the official procedure that we apply is that as soon as we finish the legislation, we start drawing up a request to the standardization organizations to start working on new methods, or often in fact they revise existing methods to meet the requirements of the legislation. We issue a request, and then the standardization organizations look at that request, usually accept it and start working. They then at some point deliver a finished standard to that. That's called the harmonized standard. We then look at that standard and see whether it complies with all the requirements of the regulation and maybe anything additional we set out in our request. And if that's the case, then we publish an official reference to the standard in the Journal of the European Union. And once that's done, it means it doesn't mean you have to use this measurement, but it's really recognized as the state-of-the-art measurement for it. So when you use this, you have the so-called presumption of conformity that I mentioned earlier. It's very simple then. You simply have to, in your compliance documents, make reference to this standard, and the enforcement authorities will, in principle, assume that you're compliant. Of course, they're still allowed to check that. Often it happens that the final standards are not available on time for the implementation. Because as some of you may know, standardization, like developing regulations, also developing standards takes a lot of time. What we've done in the past often is publish a document that we call transitional methods of measurement. That doesn't give you the same status as a standard of which we publish references in the official journal, but it does give companies an assurance. Okay, if I use these methods, I'm probably doing it right. Probably everyone will use the same methods, and the enforcement authorities will use these methods. So that's an option that we often use in case the standards are not available on time. So then back again to local space heaters specifically. The regulations were published last year, July. Immediately after that, we started consulting on a standardization request. I have to say this, that standardization request covers 3 regulations at once. The regulation for local space heaters using gas, liquid fuels and electricity. The regulation that we're dealing with today for the solid fuel appliances, and also the regulation on energy labeling. The standardization mandate is relatively straightforward. Because we have the requirements of the legislation, we're in essence repeating the requirements of the legislation and asking for standards to implement that. I would say there's only one extra aspect in there, and that's the request for a single measurement method for particulate matter. The legislation doesn't specifically refer to that, but all the member states agree that in future it would be good at some point in the future that we all use one method instead of the 3 that are currently allowed. So that, I would say that's the only additional element on top of the normal requirements of the regulation that is in the standardization request. The stage that we're in at is now that, so we've consulted everyone, then we've consulted our colleagues in the Commission, which we have to do, and then member states experts from the Committee on Standards vote on the standardization request. They've just done that, and I can say they had a positive vote, which means that in about a month we will adopt it and send it to the standardization organizations. In this case, CEN and CENELEC. As you have heard before, there have already been discussions in CEN and also CENELEC, because this whole process of preparing a standardization mandate is a very transparent one. CEN and CENELEC get very frequent updates if we change anything to the drafts. So when we actually send it to member states for vote, they also receive it, and they've adopted the practice of, in fact, starting to vote themselves already as well, even though they haven't officially received it from us yet. And I've been informed that while CENELEC is ready to accept it, in CEN the vote was not successful. So that will, as I understand, mean that once they get our standardization request, they will reject it. They have not yet clearly indicated what the reasons behind this are. It's not obvious to me what the reasons could be behind this, because as I said, most of what's in the mandate is simply already in the regulation. And I had the impression there was some there were a number of comments from sides that were not happy with the regulation. Unfortunately, that's not something we can deal with that in that context. So that we'll have to wait a bit until the process is actually officially finalized, and then we can see how to deal with this situation. It's not so obvious to me how to deal with that. Nevertheless, and if the mandate would be rejected by CEN, that means the work, for example, for the solid fuel local space heaters would be done. The standardization work would be done a bit in a void. It still means the work can go on, of course. Measurement methods are needed, and as I mentioned earlier, we as the Commission have alternative ways of referencing to measurement methods if needed. And I hope today's discussion will help us in at least a lot further also on the practical side of measuring particulate matter, and not only on the procedural elements in terms of standardization. But I'm happy to answer any questions in that area if needed. I think that covers what I wanted to share up front. I'm happy to take any questions at any moment that is suitable in terms of the planning of today's event.